At 2:17 a.m., the sirens didn't stop. They usually rise, hold, and fade. A warning, a window, a system that still works. This time, they layered. One wave rolled into the next, then another, then another. Within minutes, the sky over Tel Aviv was no longer defined by darkness, but by streaks, interceptors climbing, missiles descending, flashes breaking across the horizon in uneven intervals. Some were stopped, some were not. And that difference between what gets intercepted and what gets through is where everything changed. Because it only takes a few. The first impacts came fast. Not in one place, but across the city, a residential block, a traffic artery, a communications node. The pattern wasn't random, it was distributed, designed to stretch response, not concentrate it. That's when the rhythm of the city began to fracture. Elevators stopped mid-floor. Traffic froze in intersections. Phones lit up all at once, alerts, calls, messages, stacking faster than they could be answered. Families moved without speaking, guided by repetition and instinct, towards stairwells, towards shelters, toward anything below ground. And still, the sirens didn't stop. If you want to follow this kind of breakdown as it unfolds, not just the headline, but the structure underneath it, stay with the channel. Because what happened here wasn't just a strike. It was a system under pressure. Because once you see the pattern, the rest of this starts to make more sense. At first glance, it looked like escalation. Another exchange. Another night in a conflict already defined by cycles of strike and response. But the structure underneath was different. This was not a single barrage aimed at one symbolic target. It was layered pressure across a functioning city, multiple entry points, multiple timings. Enough to stretch interception capacity, enough to test coordination, enough to force decisions under compression. And that compression is where systems fail. Missile defense is not designed to be perfect. It is designed to manage probability, to reduce impact, not eliminate it. Every interception costs time, money, and inventory. Every missed interception carries a cost that multiplies across infrastructure, across confidence, across behavior. So the question is never, can everything be stopped? The question is, what happens when enough gets through? That answer started to take shape in the first 30 minutes. Emergency services deployed immediately, but not in a single direction. Calls were coming in from multiple districts at once. Fire crews split, medical units rerouted. Command centers began triaging not just injuries, but priorities. Which site first? Which fire matters more? Which road is still usable? Those are not questions a city wants to answer in real time. And yet, that's exactly what was happening. The first visible damage told only part of the story. A damaged building is immediate. Concrete, glass, smoke. Something you can point to. But the deeper strain appeared in the invisible layers. Communications networks slowed under surge. Not failure yet, but latency, delays. Messages arriving seconds too late to be useful. Small gaps in coordination that widen under pressure. Transportation began to lock. Not because every road was blocked, but because uncertainty spreads faster than information. Drivers stopped, turned around, abandoned routes. Intersections became points of hesitation instead of flow. That is how a system begins to stall. And then came the second wave. Not identical, adjusted. Different angles. Slightly different timing. Enough to force recalibration. Enough to keep defenses engaged without pause. Because once a defense system is active, it is consuming resources, interceptors, attention, decision, bandwidth. That is the hidden cost of persistence. It's not just what gets hit, it's what stays activated. Inside shelters, time stretches. Minutes feel longer when you don't know whether the next impact is seconds away or already overhead. People check phones, refresh feeds. Try to piece together a map from fragments. Where was that one? Was it close? Is it over? No clear answers, only partial signals. And that uncertainty feeds behavior. Some stay, some move, some decide the safest place is no longer where they are. That's when the first signs of something larger began to appear. Movement, not organized yet, but directional. Families gathering essentials. Cars being loaded. Conversations shifting from wait it out to how long can we stay. No official order, not yet. But the logic had already started forming. Because when impacts are distributed, there is no single safe zone. And when the system protecting the city is visibly strained, even if still functioning, the perception of safety changes faster than the reality, and perception drives movement. Emergency broadcasts attempted to stabilize the situation. Instructions repeated, stay near shelters, limit movement, follow official guidance. But guidance depends on trust, and trust depends on consistency. When sirens don't stop, consistency disappears. The third sequence didn't need to be larger. It only needed to be timed. Time to hit as systems were already engaged. Time to arrive when crews were mid-response. Time to keep the city from resetting. That is how pressure accumulates. And by then, the question inside the system was no longer about the strike itself. It was about duration. How long can this continue? Because a city can absorb a shock, even multiple shocks, but sustained pressure changes the equation entirely. It forces a shift from response to survival mode. Hospitals began adjusting intake protocols, not overwhelmed but preparing to be. Schools, already closed in some areas, expanded closures. Offices transitioned to remote where possible, but connectivity issues began to interfere. Each adjustment makes sense on its own. Together, they signal something else. A system pulling inward. That is the early stage of contraction. And contraction, once it begins, is difficult to reverse quickly, because every layer, transport, communication, services, civilian behavior, starts reinforcing the same decision. Reduce exposure, reduce movement, reduce risk, which, in effect, means reducing function. And that is where the situation starts to change character. Because the visible damage, the buildings, the fires, the impact zones, that is only the first layer. The deeper shift is operational. A city designed for millions of daily movements begins to hesitate, then slow, then partially stop. Not completely, not yet, but enough to feel it. Enough for people to start asking a different question. Not what just happened. But how long can this continue before normal life becomes impossible? And once that question enters the system, the next phase is already forming. Because what follows is not just about impact, it's about whether the city can still function at all. Tel Aviv is not just where people live. It is where systems meet. Finance, technology, transportation, communications layers that normally operate in parallel, quietly, efficiently. Most of the time, they are invisible. You don't see them working. You only notice them when they slow, or when they stop. And that distinction matters, because what was under pressure was not only buildings, it was the structure that allows the country to function day to day. Tel Aviv concentrates a disproportionate share of Israel's economic activity. Banking operations, corporate headquarters, startup ecosystems, data infrastructure, all clustered within a relatively small geographic footprint. Decisions made here ripple outward quickly. Transactions processed here support activity far beyond the city itself. So when disruption reaches this layer, it doesn't stay local. It spreads. Take financial operations. Markets don't require physical presence in the same way they once did, but they still rely on stable infrastructure power, connectivity, secure data flow, coordinated teams. When communications slow, even slightly, timing becomes uncertain, and in finance, timing is everything. A delay of seconds can mean a missed transaction. A delay of minutes can mean exposure. Multiply that across institutions, and the effect compounds. Then there is the technology sector. Tel Aviv is one of the central nodes of Israel's tech economy. Offices can go remote, yes, but remote depends on networks. And networks depend on physical infrastructure that can be disrupted, degraded, or simply overwhelmed during sustained pressure. Even partial instability forces companies to shift posture. Operations become defensive, development slows, decisions are delayed. That is not collapse, but it is contraction. Transportation tells a similar story. Tel Aviv is a hub: roads, rail, logistics routes, all feeding through or around it. When movement becomes uncertain, even briefly, it affects supply chains. Deliveries are delayed, routes are rerouted, some simply stop. Again, not because everything is destroyed, because enough is uncertain, and uncertainty spreads faster than damage. Power and utilities form another layer. Modern cities are resilient by design. Redundancies exist, backup systems activate, but those systems are built for interruptions, not continuous strain. When the pressure is sustained, redundancy becomes depletion. Backup becomes primary, then backup to the backup. Each layer holds for a while. But the question becomes how long? Civil defense infrastructure adds another dimension. Shelters, warning systems, interception networks, all designed to absorb shocks and protect civilians. And they do. But they are not infinite systems. Shelters can fill. Warning systems can only inform, not prevent. Interceptors can be launched, but each launch carries a cost: financial, logistical, and strategic. So the system works, but at a price. And the price increases with every wave. That is where the concept of capacity becomes critical. Not just physical capacity, how many people can fit in shelters, how many interceptors can be deployed, but operational capacity. How many simultaneous decisions can be made effectively? How many incidents can be managed at once before coordination begins to slip? Because once coordination slips, the system doesn't fail all at once. It fragments. One area responds well, another lags, a third becomes isolated. And that unevenness is what creates vulnerability. From the outside, Tel Aviv may still appear functional. Lights on, some traffic moving, services still operating. But internally, the load is shifting. Teams are stretched. Systems are operating closer to their limits. Margins for error are shrinking. And that matters more than the visible damage. Because cities don't shut down when everything breaks. They shut down when enough small failures align. Consider communication again. Even slight degradation, slower data speeds, intermittent outages forces adjustments. People rely more on incomplete information. Decisions are made with less certainty. That increases risk. In emergency response, seconds matter. In coordination, clarity matters. When both are reduced, outcomes change. Now extend that across multiple layers at once. Finance under strain, tech adapting, transport uncertain, communications degraded, civil defense fully engaged. Individually manageable, together they create a system under continuous pressure. And that pressure alters behavior. Businesses begin to reassess exposure. Do operations continue as normal? Do teams relocate? Do critical functions move elsewhere? Households ask similar questions. Stay or leave? Wait or act? Each decision, taken independently, is rational. Collectively, they shift the system. Movement increases not as panic, but as precaution. Traffic patterns change. Certain districts empty faster than others. Temporary relocations begin to resemble something more permanent. This is how an evacuation logic forms before any official declaration. Not as a single command, but as a distributed decision-making process. And once that process reaches a certain scale, it becomes self-reinforcing. More people leaving makes staying feel riskier. More closures make normal activity harder. More uncertainty makes long-term planning impossible. That is the transition point. A city can operate under threat. It can adapt, absorb, continue. But once the balance tips from adaptation to withdrawal, the nature of the situation changes. It is no longer about managing disruption. It becomes about preserving what remains functional. And that is a very different objective. Because preservation is defensive, it limits exposure, reduces activity, protects core assets, but it also means something else. It means accepting that normal operations cannot continue at full scale. And that acceptance is what transforms a strike into something larger. Not just damage, but systemic interruption, the kind that reaches beyond infrastructure and into confidence. Because confidence is the invisible layer that holds everything together. Confidence that systems will respond, that services will function, that movement is possible, that risk is manageable. Once that confidence weakens, behavior changes faster than infrastructure. People act ahead of the system. And that is when evacuation stops being a reaction and starts becoming a strategy. But for that to happen, something else has to be understood clearly. Not just why the system is under pressure, but how that pressure is being applied in the first place. The assumption behind missile defense is simple. Not everything will be stopped. The system is built to reduce damage, not eliminate it, to intercept enough threats that the city can continue functioning even under attack. It buys time. It preserves structure. It keeps pressure below the level where systems begin to break. But that only works under certain conditions. Limited volume, predictable timing, manageable angles. Once those conditions change, the system behaves differently. Because missile defense is not just technology, it is math. Every incoming object must be tracked, classified, and assigned a response. That response must be calculated in real-time trajectory, interception point, probability of success. Then, an interceptor is launched, which itself has a cost, a range, and a success rate. Now multiply that by dozens, then hundreds. The system does not fail instantly, it becomes selective. That is the first shift. Not every incoming threat is engaged. Some are calculated as low risk. Some are allowed through because the probability of interception is too low. Others are prioritized based on trajectory, heading toward dense areas versus open ground. This is not a malfunction. It is optimization under constraint. But from the ground, it looks like something else. It looks like gaps. And once those gaps become visible, the perception of protection begins to change. That is where pressure starts to build, not just physically, but psychologically. Because the system still works, it is still intercepting. Explosions in the sky confirm that, but the ones that get through carry more weight than the ones that are stopped. They redefine expectations. The next layer is cost. An interceptor is not a trivial resource. Each launch carries a financial cost that can reach tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes more depending on the system used. The incoming projectile, by contrast, can be significantly cheaper. This creates an asymmetry. One side spends more to defend than the other spends to attack. That imbalance does not matter in a short exchange. It matters in duration. Because over time, inventories become a constraint. Interceptors are not infinite. They must be produced, transported, loaded, maintained. Under sustained pressure, usage rates increase faster than replenishment. And once inventory becomes a factor, decision-making tightens. Engage or conserve. Intercept or accept. Those are not abstract questions. They are operational choices made in seconds. And each choice carries a trade-off. Now consider saturation. If multiple missiles arrive at once, from different directions, at slightly different altitudes, the system must divide its attention. Sensors track multiple objects. Command systems assign priorities. Launch platforms execute in sequence. But sequence introduces delay. Even fractions of a second matter when trajectories are converging. So the system begins to triage. High-risk targets first, lower risk later, some not at all. Again, not failure. Constraint. But constraint, under pressure, produces visible outcomes. More impacts, more uncertainty, more demand on emergency response. And that is only one dimension. Because the incoming threats are not identical, some are faster, some maneuver, some carry multiple submunitions, cluster-type payloads that disperse into smaller projectiles mid-flight. These are harder to track as a single object and harder to intercept efficiently. Instead of one target, there are many. And that multiplies the problem. Sensors must distinguish between real threats and debris. Interceptors must be allocated carefully. Misallocation wastes resources. Underallocation allows impacts. There is no perfect solution. Only trade-offs. So the system adapts. It shifts posture. It recalibrates thresholds. It may choose to protect certain zones more heavily than others. Critical infrastructure, dense population centers, strategic assets, which means coverage becomes uneven. Some areas feel more protected, others less. That unevenness is subtle at first, but people notice patterns. They begin to map risk, not just by location, but by observed outcomes. Where did interceptions happen? Where did impacts occur? Which areas feel consistently covered? And that perception feeds behavior. But the deeper issue is not perception. It is endurance. Because defense systems are designed with cycles in mind: engage, reset, reload, reassess. Sustained pressure compresses those cycles. There is less time to reset, less time to reposition, less time to evaluate. Everything moves closer together. And when cycles compress, errors become more likely. Not catastrophic errors, small ones. A delay, a misclassification, a missed opportunity to engage. Individually manageable, collectively significant. So ask yourself, would any defense system hold indefinitely under that kind of sustained, layered pressure? Not just against a single wave, but against repeated sequences designed to prevent recovery. Because that is the key. This is not only about volume, it is about timing. The second wave arrives before the system fully resets from the first. The third arrives while response units are still deployed. The fourth tests whether inventory has already been reduced. Each wave is not just an attack. It is a probe, testing response times, testing allocation logic, testing thresholds, learning. And once patterns are identified, pressure becomes more efficient. Fewer resources needed to achieve greater disruption. That is where the balance begins to shift. Not suddenly, gradually. More impacts in meaningful locations, more strain on response systems, more visible signs that protection is not absolute. And once that becomes clear, behavior changes again. People do not need a full system failure to reassess risk. They only need evidence that the system is under strain. Because strain implies limits, and limits imply outcomes. At that point, the defense system is still operational, still intercepting, still reducing damage. But it is no longer defining the situation. It is reacting to it. And when a defense system moves from shaping outcomes to responding under pressure, the strategic advantage shifts. The attack does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be persistent. Because persistence forces decisions. And those decisions where to allocate, what to protect, what to accept, gradually reshape the system itself. More protection here means less there. More conservation now means more risk later. Every choice carries forward. That is how pressure accumulates. Not in a single overwhelming moment, but in a series of constrained decisions that narrow options over time, and once options narrow enough, the system begins to prioritize something else entirely. Not full protection, but survivability, and that is the point where the logic of the situation changes again. Because when a system shifts from defending everything to preserving what it can, the next step is no longer about interception. It is about withdrawal. Evacuation is never the first response. It sits at the far end of the decision chain. Cities are designed to absorb disruption, to adapt, to continue functioning even under stress. That is the principle behind modern urban resilience: keep systems running, keep people in place, maintain continuity. Because once people leave at scale, continuity breaks. So evacuation is delayed for as long as possible. But there is a threshold. Not a single moment, not a single event. A threshold built from accumulation, repeated impacts, slower response times, growing uncertainty, subtle shifts in daily behavior that, taken together, point in one direction: away. At first, movement is voluntary. Families with flexibility relocate temporarily, not far, just enough to feel safer. A few days, maybe a week. Essentials packed lightly. The assumption is that normal life will resume quickly. That assumption matters. Because as long as people believe disruption is temporary, the system holds. Work continues remotely, schools pause but plan to reopen, businesses adjust schedules instead of shutting down. It feels like a pause, not a departure. But then duration begins to stretch. The attacks do not stop. The intervals between them shorten or become unpredictable. Nights blur into mornings without clear separation between alert and silence. And that is when temporary thinking starts to shift. Precaution becomes planning. What began as just in case becomes how long can this last? That question changes behavior. More people begin to leave not because of panic, but because of calculation. Risk is reassessed. the cost of staying rises, not just in terms of safety, but in terms of stability. Parents think about children, employers think about continuity, hospitals think about capacity. Each decision is rational. Together, they create momentum. Traffic patterns change first. Outbound routes become heavier than inbound. Not a surge yet, but a noticeable imbalance. Fuel demand increases. Rental availability in surrounding areas tightens. These are early indicators. Not of collapse, of transition. Because evacuation, in modern cities, is rarely a single event. It is a process. And processes accelerate. As more people leave, the environment for those remaining changes. Fewer services, reduced operating hours. Certain businesses close temporarily, others operate with limited staff. The city does not stop, but it becomes thinner, less dense, less predictable. And that thinness affects perception. Empty spaces signal something. Closed storefronts signal something. Reduced traffic signals something. They reinforce the idea that normal conditions no longer apply. At that point, official guidance begins to adjust. Not immediately toward full evacuation. That decision carries weight: political, logistical, psychological. It acknowledges that the system cannot guarantee stability in certain areas. So, the language shifts first. Recommendations expand. Stay near shelters becomes limit movement. Limit movement becomes consider relocation if possible. Each step is incremental, but the direction is clear. Because authorities are managing two pressures at once. On one side, the need to maintain order and prevent unnecessary disruption. On the other, the obligation to reduce risk as conditions deteriorate. Balancing those pressures becomes harder as the situation persists. And persistence is the key variable. A single night of heavy strikes can be absorbed, even several, but sustained pressure changes planning horizons. Emergency services begin rotating staff more aggressively. Fatigue becomes a factor. Equipment usage increases. Maintenance cycles shorten. Small inefficiencies begin to appear. Again, not failure. Strain. Hospitals shift from routine operations to prioritization. Non-essential procedures are delayed. Resources are reserved for potential surges. Staff availability fluctuates as individuals manage their own exposure and family considerations. Education systems pause more broadly. Remote alternatives expand, but not all students can access them equally. Gaps form. Economic activity contracts further. Offices close not because they are destroyed, but because functioning reliably becomes difficult. Connectivity issues, staff shortages, uncertainty about the next disruption all reduce productivity. This is how economic paralysis begins. Not as a sudden stop, as a gradual reduction in capacity. Now consider the financial layer. Businesses begin to evaluate risk beyond immediate operations. Insurance coverage becomes a question. Are policies still valid under sustained conflict conditions? What clauses apply? What liabilities increase? These are not theoretical concerns. They influence decisions quickly. Some firms relocate critical functions, others suspend operations entirely. Investment decisions are delayed, capital becomes cautious. That caution spreads. Markets react not just to damage, but to expectation. If disruption is likely to continue, pricing adjusts, risk premiums rise, confidence declines. And confidence, once weakened, is difficult to restore quickly, because it depends on predictability. And predictability is exactly what sustained pressure removes. So the system tightens further. Utilities prioritize stability in critical zones. Infrastructure maintenance shifts to emergency mode. Long-term planning is paused in favor of immediate response. Every layer is now operating defensively. And defense, by nature, reduces output. At this point, the idea of evacuation is no longer abstract. It becomes structured. Zones are identified. Not necessarily entire cities at first, but districts. Areas where risk is assessed as higher, where infrastructure is more exposed, where response times may be longer. Guidance becomes more direct. If you can relocate, do so. That phrase carries weight, because it signals a shift in responsibility from centralized management to distributed decision-making. Authorities provide information, individuals act. And when enough individuals act in the same direction, the effect is equivalent to an official order. Population density drops. Services contract further. The city transitions from partial function to limited function. And once that transition reaches a certain scale, reversal becomes difficult, because returning requires confidence that conditions have stabilized, not improved slightly, stabilized. That is a higher bar. Meanwhile, the effects extend beyond the city itself. Neighboring regions absorb incoming populations. Housing demand rises. Infrastructure in those areas adjusts to new loads. Temporary becomes semi-permanent. Supply chains reroute. Logistics networks adapt to new patterns. Some changes persist even after conditions improve. This is how local disruption becomes regional and potentially national. Because when a central node like Tel Aviv reduces function, the system reorganizes around that absence. Not perfectly, but enough to continue. At a cost. That cost is not only economic, it is structural. Relationships between systems change, dependencies shift, priorities realign. And once those changes settle, returning to the previous state is not guaranteed. So evacuation is not just a response to immediate danger. It is a turning point, a signal that the system has moved from managing disruption to restructuring itself under pressure. And that signal matters far beyond the moment it is declared. Because it tells you something about the trajectory, not just where things are, but where they are heading. A city that begins to empty under sustained pressure is no longer only defending against strikes. It is adjusting to a new operating reality. And once that adjustment begins, the question is no longer how to stop the next impact. It is whether normal life, as it existed before, can return at all.